From Hollywood, it's Out of My Mind. I'm Jay Douglas, and in episode 12, we're going from the hot seat to the hot hits, but only after we know the score. Welcome to another 17 minutes for baby boomers like you who haven't lost their curiosity. It's all the essential, non-essential, and curiously essential information that used to come into your home on a $5 radio. Now you have to listen to it on a $1,000 computer. If you're not a baby boomer, you can still enjoy the program. All you have to do is complete the sentence, "Every boy wants a blank." Here's a hint, and so do girls. We're just toying with you as episode 12 of Out of My Mind begins by turning up the heat. It doesn't seem all that long ago that those of us with long hair and patches on our jeans were the target of cries like, "Get a job!" Now we might be yelling that to ourselves. When you're a baby boomer, a job interview might seem like an invitation into another dimension, where the titles, questions, and people you encounter are out to get you. Our good friend Peter Desberg, psychologist, professor emeritus of psychology, and stage fright expert, says that not only is this untrue, believing that it is will make you the world's worst job candidate.
When you're about to go and do an interview, the predictions you're making, the things that you're telling yourself about how it's going to be are really, really important to how you're going to feel. So if you start thinking of all the different types of predictions that people make, I'm out of practice, I'm rusty, people who are used to being interviewed know the standard questions and they've already prepared answers and I don't have them. I'm going to be asked about my previous experience and it's not going to match up to people in the new workforce who've been in lots of different situations and lots of different kinds of jobs. As I tell myself all of these things, I'm going to begin to scare myself.
And why stop it scared?
If we start saying to ourselves, this is it, this is my one chance to get a really good job, and if I don't do well here, not only won't I get a second chance like this, but there's a network of people and they're going to tell everybody, don't even bother interviewing this guy, and then pretty soon you're never going to work in this town again.
Yep, that's what it's like for us. We're no match for the 20, 30, or 40-somethings that are lining up for this job too. Come on.
The thing that you want to remember is this is all in your head.
Reality check. You have control over how confident you are when you walk in the door. And who better to help build your confidence than your friends?
Get a few friends together and do practice, do mock interviews. And if you have access to it, get people of different ages, people with different kinds of backgrounds, and ask them to progressively get more and more intense as they're questioning you.
Get more intense? That's not some sort of trick Peter learned in a psychology magazine. There's a real-world issue here that can wreak havoc on an interview, unless you're ready for it.
I've spoken to a lot of people now that say the job market has changed so much that literally people get hostile in the question. What makes you think you're good enough to work here? If you're not ready for this, if you think you're going to be treated politely, it's really, really a benefit to you to have had this from friends and been prepared.
Prepared or not, though, it's hard to sit across the table from some kid and get insulted. You don't have to take it, but you do have to know how to handle it.
Let's say somebody literally is yelling at you saying, "I've looked at your experience. You don't look like you can do any of the things we're going to need here." What I would do there is to say, well, why don't you tell me some of the things you think I'm going to have to do here, and then I'll show you whether I think I can handle them or not. And what you do is you put the ball back on their court, put the pressure on them to have to come up with specifics that you can respond to, because there's no way that you can be swatting at air saying, well, I think I'm good enough to do what you do here.
This strategy of putting the onus on the interviewer, of sharing control of your interview, well, it works well even if the interview is as civilized as high tea. It's especially useful when the interviewer gets around to that big question you've all been waiting for. So, dude, what's your biggest weakness?
Everybody is now prepared for the terrible answer of, well, I care too much, I work too hard, I take my work home with me. Don't answer that question. Answer it with, tell me something bad that's happened to you and how you've grown from it.
Peter says the trick is staying away from generalities and turning the question, any question, into something specific. Because once you have something specific to talk about, you can tell the interviewer a little story.
People love stories. So you always want to be a storyteller, but you want to make sure that it's really, really relevant to the question.
Peter Desberg is Professor Emeritus of Psychology at California State University, Dominguez Hills, and a practicing psychologist specializing in stage fright. He has a humorous and fascinating story about an experiment in using anxiety to improve your performance in pressure situations. It's an episode extra, and I've put it on YouTube. Go to outofmymindpodcast on YouTube.com. That's outofmymindpodcast on YouTube.com. Click on playlists and then choose extras. I don't know about you, but it seems to me that my favorite music, the music of the top 40 era from about 1955 to 1972, well, it's getting harder to find on the radio. I was wondering if that's a sign that we're losing interest in the music we grew up with. You know, it's nearly a 60-year run, and that's a long time for anything in our culture to maintain its popularity. To satisfy my curiosity, I made a call to Dick Bartley.
Really, honestly, when we were teenagers, I mean, the music was everything. It was the soundtrack. It was the backdrop. It informed everything, you know, we thought and felt and did. I think that the people who grew up loving the music of the 50s and the 60s are a little more passionate about their music than the people who grew up loving the music of the 70s and 80s.
Dick would know. For 35 years, he's hosted a series of Saturday night request shows on radio stations across the country. Every week, he's right there talking to listeners, finding out who likes what kind of music and why. But before we go any further, you need to know that Dick's not your ordinary disc jockey. He's, well, would fanatic be an understatement?
I was really passionate about that stuff. I absolutely love the top 40 music and the jingles and the contest and the whole sound of it, and it just clicked.
But wait, there's more. Dick's passion wasn't so much a choice as it was fate. No, really. Did you grow up with career signposts like this?
I was raised in Syracuse, and we lived within sightline of the antennas of the towers of one of the local top 40 stations, WNDR. Once I became aware of, that's where the music's coming from, I would hop on my bike. I had a friend named Jim Schultz, and we would pedal down to the station. So I became enchanted with the whole radio station mystique very young. And later, my dad moved us from Syracuse down to Central Virginia, Lynchburg. And once again, I lived within biking distance of the local top 40 station. My seventh grade school, the ball fields backed up to the property of the radio station with its 4 AM towers. So I guess it was kind of in the cards for me to get involved in top 40 radio.
So when Dick says baby boomers may be getting grayer, but they're still connecting with their music, it's not speculation.
Music was more than just something that was on the radio. It was literally a part of the fabric of their lives.
It's not that we're walking away from our music. There seems to be this tiny disconnect when it comes to baby boomers' music and the advertisers who pay DJs to play it. That and technology are changing our listening habits. And nobody's asking us for our vote.
I think if you are a dedicated fan, let's just say the 60s for argument's sake, there's no shortage of outlets for you to find 60s music somewhere. Now, is it on your local radio dial? Probably not. And the reason, just do the math on that. What do the advertisers want? They want a demographic that is going to buy their product and buy their service and, spend a lot of money. And if you do the math on folks who grew up with and loved the 50s and 60s, they're on the backside of that big bell curve. And so it's completely understandable. I mean, it's the way commerce is.
Now, Dick's right. It's the way commerce is. Who would have thought it was those 20, 30, and 40-somethings buying all those high-end luxury cars, taking those cruises, paying for quality estate planning advice, and purchasing brand-name medications? I'm speechless. So let's get back to Dick. Being in the radio business, you'd expect him to feel these changes, maybe more than we do. So if you hear a touch of wistfulness in his voice when he talks about the changes he hears, I'm right there with him.
Yeah, it's kind of sad.
Well, cheer up. Dick Bartley has been an institution on Saturday nights for 35 years, and he shows no signs of giving up on taking requests and playing the music that shaped the lives of generations. He's a member of the National Radio Hall of Fame, and currently he hosts and produces 2 request programs, Rock and Roll's Greatest Hits and the Classic Countdown. If your local radio station is one of those that's given up on us, you can be part of his show via the internet. I've put a link in the show notes, along with a few simple directions on how to listen. I've also posted an episode extra on YouTube, in which Dick tells the story of how his 35-year request radio run began. Yeah, I do get paid by the alliteration. Why do you ask? You can listen to Dick's story by going to outofmymindpodcastonyoutube.com. That's outofmymindpodcastonyoutube.com. Click on playlists and choose extras. If you've ever left a movie admiring or even thinking about the score, congratulations. You're part of a frequently discussed topic in film circles. Good or bad, are you supposed to notice the score? And along with that, what is a film score supposed to do? I always enjoy a good unanswered question, so I sat down with film composer Charles Bernstein to get his opinion. He's scored over 100 feature films and television shows, he teaches film composing, and he's written nearly 100 essays on film and film music. For Charles, music is a part of a film's storytelling, and the composer is part of the film's storytelling team.
The cinematographer is kind of like the eye, the viewer. It's showing us what we need to see. The writers are creating what we're going to need to hear, and the actors are presenting it and demonstrating it and so forth. The editor is kind of like the tailor who comes in and sews things together and creates a nice, well-fitting suit. Often, those other areas can't really tell you how to feel. They can present you with story, they can present you with image, they can sew these things together fast or slow or in any which way. We're not always sure in the movie medium what it is that we're supposed to be feeling while we're experiencing the story.
And this is where the fun begins. Emotion is a critical part of watching a film. Now, there are those who argue that if the director and the actors do their jobs properly, that should be enough to stir our feelings. Charles says there's anecdotal evidence to refute this.
My mom, who passed away at the age of 101, played piano up until the end. When she was young, she accompanied silent films on the Wurlitzer organ. And in a sense, she was one of the very first film composers, if you look at it that way. It's interesting that even though we call them silent films, even at the very, very beginning, very first time in Paris, I think as early as the end of the 1800s, 1895 maybe, somewhere in there, they actually had a musician. Some people speculate that the mechanism of the projector was noisy and the music would, make it a little more aesthetic, pleasing to the viewer. But essentially, I think the emotional neutrality of film, there's an emotional ambiguity about it that music can settle.
In fact, we were used to having music deepen the emotional experience of a story before we saw our first film or heard our first film score.
When our parents are telling us a story, it's the sound of their voice. They'll say, and then there's someone lurking. There's something in the music of the voice it was so exciting. The voice kind of does something that the music can do, which is to provide an emotional reference point. You're supposed to be feeling uneasy here. So the music does have a very important part to play in storytelling.
Now, that's one example of the use of music, and as Charles points out, it's also an example of how music can extend the words and images that are film's building blocks.
The music, when it works best, is bringing something additional. I remember writing a terribly, terribly sad piece of music for an extremely funny scene in an old movie called Love at First Bite. George Hamilton is playing Dracula, and he's complaining to Renfield, I guess is his little assistant's name. He's complaining about how horrible it is to be Dracula and have to dress as a head waiter for the last 700 years, and it's a lament, and he's so heartbroken about his fate. and the music is terribly, terribly sad, and the effect is terribly, terribly funny. If the music were trying to be funny, while George Hamilton is also trying to be funny, instead of giving him that serious background against which to be funny, it wouldn't work well. So that's a case where the music is bringing something that isn't particularly in the scene.
Sometimes the score's job is to make the invisible or the subtle visible.
Familiar and unfamiliar are two sides of a coin that Stanley Kubrick had to wrestle with in 2001, A Space Odyssey. He used the most familiar music ever written, Blue Danube Waltz and Khachaturian, various things that everyone knew, Daisy, Daisy, Bicycle Built for Two, very, very familiar. And then he took music from Ligeti, who's not only unfamiliar, he had just written this stuff a year or two earlier, and when he wrote it, it was the most unfamiliar sounding music ever written. And what Kubrick did is he manipulated the audience with familiarity and total unfamiliarity to create this world of surrealism, basically.
Charles is not afraid to call a film score manipulative. In fact, I think he's proud of it. For Charles, the question is not whether the music manipulates us, but how well it does it.
Like all manipulation, it's great as long as you don't get caught at it. If the music is identified as being manipulative, then it has sort of failed. But it is manipulative. It's basically telling us how to feel, which is enormously manipulative, but that's its role.
Charles will be back in episode 14, that's 2 episodes from now, with more about the role of the film score, including whether the score should be able to stand apart from the film it's in. Charles Bernstein is a composer, writer, academic, and creator of over 100 film and television scores, and author of at least as many essays on the subject of film and music. And on that note, we bring to an end episode 12 of Out of My Mind. With an even dozen shows behind us, practically the length of a television season today, I'd like to know how we're doing with our little program here. Now seriously, drop me an email. I'd like to hear from you, and I answer all my email personally. You'll find my email address at outofmymindpodcast.com. That's outofmymindpodcast.com. Click on episode 12 and scroll down to Contact the Show. While you're writing me, I'll be working on a brand new show for next Saturday at 8 a.m. Eastern. We'll talk then. I'm Jay Douglas. Out of My Mind is produced by Penny Summers and is a production of the Theater of Your Mind Incorporated, Hollywood, California.